Hajar, when I say harem, what comes to your mind?
The picture that comes to my mind is a 1001 night style castle inhabited only by women and only one man being allowed to access it, potentially the sultan. And here, to be honest, I guess I'm guilty of watching a historical Turkish soap opera a couple of years ago, which depicted this picture. How far off am I?
Well, not wrong, but not quite right either. Because harem, well, it has a much more layered history than the soaps would have us believe.
Welcome to Threads of Africa, a space where African voices, books, and ideas come alive. Each episode, we open the pages of books, narrations, and oral traditions that carry the rhythms, struggles, and dreams of the continent. I'm Hajar,
And I'm Ramdan.
and together we're weaving a richer understanding of Africa, one thread at a time.
You know, sometimes our own misconceptions reveal just how deeply stereotypes can shape our thinking without us even realizing it. And yeah, even as an African myself, I'm not immune to these kind of biases about Africa and its people.
Indeed.
Yeah. So, my story with the book we'll be discussing today, Dreams of Trespass, Tales of a Harem Girlhood by Fatima Mernissi, starts with one such misconception. A simple misconception, but a telling one. It was about language. And let me explain.
Mm-hmm.
I have this habit of, I like to read books in the original language whenever I can because it just feels more authentic, right?
Yeah. And I like to watch movies in the original language as well.
Yeah. So when I picked up Dreams of Trespass, I automatically assumed that since Mernissi was from Morocco, she must have written it in French. It makes sense, right?
Yeah, and especially taking into consideration that she wrote it even before Moroccan independence.
Yeah, right? Well, reality had other plans, you know. You know how in translated books they usually include a note on the first few pages mentioning who translated it and from which language it was translated from. So that's how I fell from the clouds. The book wasn't originally written in French; it was in English.
Well, that's definitely not the language I expected you to say. I was thinking you would go to Arabic, but English is definitely not expected for a Moroccan author.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, Menisi was multilingual. She could she could write in several languages. But my assumption was automatic, and that's the thing. Um, this kind of thinking happens a lot to Africans, even among ourselves. We internalize these ideas about what languages we should speak, what cultures we should be tied to, and
Yeah.
many more misconceptions. Anyway, back to the book. It was published in 1994, a magical year.
Wondering why?
And it has been translated into more than 20 languages, making it accessible to readers worldwide. And if you haven't read Dreams of Trespass, well, it's a very powerful, beautifully written memoir. And a New York Times article I read said it was described by many reviewers as a memoir and by some as a novel. But it can be considered as a hybrid of both genres.
This is an interesting piece of information. So, is it a real story or not?
A lot. It's almost like an autobiography, but it's a memoir where you sometimes come across fiction, a lot of fictional stories.
So enhanced memoir,
Yeah.
if we can say. Since this one is an autobiography, are you going to tell us a bit more about the author?
Well, yeah, if you like. So the late Professor Fatima Mernissi was a Moroccan scholar whose work profoundly shaped conversations around gender, feminism, socio-political change, and in Islam. But not just in Morocco, it was across the world because her research and writing established her as one of the leading voices in what would later be known as Islamic feminism.
And I find that concept of Islamic feminism intriguing. And I would like to put a pin in that and come back to it later because I did some research about the idea or the concept.
Yeah. So she was, in every sense, an unapologetic pioneer, someone who boldly challenged social and intellectual norms at a time and in a place where doing so was anything but easy. Because just imagine she was born in 1940 in Fez, Morocco, a beautiful city. And by the time she passed away in 2015, she had helped reshape global feminist and academic discourse. Her voice continues to echo today through the generations of thinkers and activists she inspired.
Yep. And I think, as we said already, she was born in 1940, so Morocco was colonized by the French, and then obviously she lived through the independence and the modern Morocco.
Yeah. During her early childhood, she didn't go to modern school. She first went to a Quranic school or a madrasa before transitioning to a so-called modern school. I mean, she refers to it in the memoir as modern school.
Is that French style?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And she recounted the transition moments in the book we'll be discussing today. And to close this introduction, I will leave you with one of her quotes, which captures her spirits perfectly, I believe. It went like this, and I quote, "I don't consider myself a woman of letters. I'm a woman who produces ideas. I give my raw tests to my French or American editors and let them do their job. Of course, in the end, I review and revise anything that doesn't sit right with me." End of quote. Well, now that I just read the quote, it doesn't sound interesting. Maybe you should try reading it with your feminine
With
voice.
my voice?
Yeah.
Okay. So, start of quote again. I don't consider myself a woman of letters. I'm a woman who produces ideas. I give my raw text to my French or American editors and let them do their job. Of course, in the end, I review and revise anything that doesn't sit right with me.
Brilliant.
Yeah. And that's a very interesting one. It just sounds like me using, or like my relationship with ChatGPT.
Really?
Yeah, although ChatGPT did not exist obviously at that time, but yeah, it was a human ChatGPT for her. But I also like the boldness of the statement. She knows her strength and recognizes her limitations, and I believe that's inspiring, especially that women tend to be perfectionists and wouldn't go to the next big challenge. I don't know, be it a promotion to ask for, or a book to write, or a company to start up, whatever, just because it's not perfect yet or that is not fully ready. So I find it empowering, actually.
And you know what? This uh, quote, right, is essentially what she would say to women who looked up to her and claimed they were not naturally gifted writers. She encouraged them to write regardless.
Yeah, I like that.
So, okay, back to the book. Dreams of Trespass, Tales of a Harem Girlhood. Even just from the title, you can tell it's going to be something deeply personal. It's a memoir where Mernissi reflects on her childhood in Morocco and explores the everyday lives and struggles of women around her. The book is a rich tapestry of short stories, vivid anecdotes, and thoughtful footnotes. Now, usually I'm not the biggest fan of books heavy on footnotes because they can feel a bit distracting. But in this case, I found them incredibly helpful because Mernissi often uses them in in the book to explain words from Moroccan dialects or to share her thoughts on the themes she's exploring. They add depth and context rather than take away from the narrative.
Yeah, interesting that that you say that about the footnotes. But yeah, I understand that it helps give context,
Yeah.
which is interesting. Um, Also, I remember when you were reading this book, you mentioned many times that it's challenging to summarize, given that it's a collection of memoirs as opposed to a coherent story or a coherent novel.
Indeed, summarizing Dreams of Trespass isn't easy, or it wasn't easy because I did it ultimately.
Yeah.
Unlike Stay Tercent by Mugasa, which has a clearer plot line.
Yeah. And by the way, which we talked about in our earlier episode. So we invite you to check it out.
Oh, yeah, definitely check that out. So, Mernissi's memoir doesn't follow a single storyline. For instance, it drifts at times into stories from the tales of 1001 Nights, and there is even an entire chapter devoted to the tale of Princess Boudou, which I will come back to later.
Yeah, looking forward to the story. But yeah, I mean, then since you mentioned 1001 Nights, I wasn't too far off in my initial idea about the harem.
Well, yeah.
Or maybe I was.
No.
That was just a joke.
You have got the
Yeah.
point. You have got a point. Anyways, back to the main themes. I will tell you later. So first, there is the idea, or shall I say, the concept of the harem. Mernissi invites the reader to rethink what that word means.
Mm.
And according to her, it's not just a physical space. It's throughout the book, she shows us how the harem can take many forms. It can be a set of rules, boundaries, or expectations. And I think it's a powerful metaphor for restriction, especially as it applies to women's lives.
So it's definitely not as romantic, I would say, as it's depicted usually in soap operas
No.
or movies.
No, not really.
Yeah.
So the second theme I will be exploring, well, I guess you will like this one. It's about feminism, or what I like to call feminist momentum through the prism of the Arab woman. And interestingly, yeah, Mernissi rarely uses the word feminist outright, at least not prominently in the main text of Dreams of Trespass. She might refer to it more directly in her footnotes or later writings, but in this memoir, she prefers to let the stories speak for themselves. So her reflections and the experiences she shares make it impossible to ignore.
Yeah.
And she reveals the subtle and sometimes not so subtle ways women in her world resisted, questioned, and renegotiated their roles in society, especially her mom.
Yeah. So the feminism is implied from the stories. That's what
Yeah,
you're trying to say.
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. And the third theme I want to reflect on is the theme of school, or more precisely, education. In particular, I would like to explore how Mernissi describes the transition from receiving traditional Islamic instructions to attending what she sometimes call a modern school, as I previously said. So that transition is a shift that goes beyond pedagogy, right? It touches on identity, language, authority, and the deeply gendered politics of learning.
Yeah. Interesting.
And finally, there is also the theme of what I call identity blending in Morocco in the midst of transformation. It's not a constant thread throughout the book, but when it does surface, Mernissi handles it with remarkable subtlety, deep compassion, and above all, sharp clarity.
Mm.
She weaves it gently into her broader reflections on hierarchy, power, and social structure. She
So,
also, yeah, go
sorry,
ahead.
just on this one. So you're talking about the Moroccan identity and how it evolved from pre-independence times to the post-independence and modern Morocco, right?
Yeah. So identities in Morocco. Not. Don't want to say Moroccan identity, but I
Okay.
would like to say identity blending in
Yes.
this
Yeah. What makes a
territory.
Moroccan society,
Yeah,
basically.
which
Yeah.
is Morocco. Yeah.
Yeah.
So she also at times touches on the complex and painful legacy of slavery.
Mm-hmm.
Never in a didactic way, but always with sensitivity and with a careful eye for the human experience behind the historical reality.
Yeah. I mean, all of these themes are incredibly deep. And I would say it's impressive how a relatively short memoir of around 230 pages could get to this level of reflection and cover all of these areas.
I
Yeah.
definitely agree with that. Yeah. So that's the journey we are about to go on together through Fatima Mernissi's childhood memories, her sharp observations, and her quiet but firm defiance of the world she inherited. Stay with us. So the first theme, right? What is a harem? When Fatima Mernissi talks about her childhood, she describes growing up between two very different harems. The first one was the one she lived in with her parents, a traditional walled off space in the city in Fez. And you can think of it as a closed harem, four walls, a locked door, and the words defined by limits, especially for women.
Yeah.
The second belonged to her maternal grandmother. It was nothing like the first.
Mm-hmm.
It was an open, sprawling farm in the countryside, full of animals, voices, and movements. A place where women were not confined by walls. And if you like, I will call this one the open harem, and the previous one the closed harem. And in fact, Mernissi herself says that if it were up to her, she would use two entirely different words to describe them, because aside from sharing the name, they had very little in common.
Yeah. And I think that indicates that not only the type of space, but also the environment, urban versus rural, does dictate or does influence how these set of rules that are the harem are.
You mean because the other one is in the rural area? The rules.
The open harem is in the rural area, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess I did not think about it, but yeah, that makes sense. She didn't refer to the location, rural versus urban, as something that kind of impacted the way rules in these two harems were conceived. But that's a good point.
Yeah.
So Mernissi recalls a strange little theory they were told as children, a kind of myth about the origins of the harem. So the story went like this. There was a time when men did nothing but fights, constant wars, endless battles, and eventually they realized that they needed a leader, someone to bring order to the chaos. And guess how they decide who should lead?
The one who killed more people?
Well, no, they organize a hunt not for land, not for treasure, but for women. And the rule was simple. The man who could gather the most women would become the sultan. And that, the story claimed, was how the idea of the harem was born. Private homes built to hide women behind closed doors, not out of love or protection, but as trophies of power. And according to that tale, this game was played across the world. Yeah, so the Byzantines supposedly won the first round. Then, centuries later, the Arabs expanded their reach, collecting more lands, more women. And eventually, a caliph named Harun al Rashid came out of the battle on top. And this happened after a series of victorious battles. So, you see, it's clearly a myth, but like many myths, it reveals a deeper truth about how power, gender, and space, or land, space and land, have long been entangled.
Yeah, indeed. And I think here what the author calls myth is, in my view, is just a simplification of recounting of the history of how patriarchy was established. So, as you know, across ancient Greece, medieval Europe, and the early Islamic world, the enslavement of women as spoils of war was a tragically common practice, which began from pragmatic wartime impulses and evolved into an institution reinforced by custom, law, and even religion. And with this regard, for example, the feminist Australian American historian Gerda Lerner argues that the dominance of women by men, which is at the core of patriarchy, actually, was literally forged by the crucible of ancient warfare. So she posits that the earliest states, or in the earliest states, men learned to subjugate other groups from practicing dominance over women, basically, and that's a quote of her. Specifically through the enslavement of women from conquered groups. And indeed, conquering armies treat women's bodies as territory to be claimed. I mean, you mentioned how kind of land and women are, at the end of the day, entangled and considered as two objects, basically, which is so basically the woman's body becomes a symbolic extension of conquering the land and people. So I think according to this idea in the book, the harem, be it a physical space or a mental limitation, represents, in my opinion, the continuation of the patriarchy, which is deeply rooted in violence and warfare, according to this narration.
Yeah, it makes sense. And in the closed harem, women were not just expected to stay indoors. They were not even allowed to peek through the windows.
Yeah.
The outside world was off limits and movements was tightly controlled. But in the open harem, things were different. Women there could roam freely. The expectation there was that they wouldn't encounter strangers because remember it's in a farm, right, in a rural area, so the landscape itself kind of offered privacy.
Yeah.
And Mernissi even said women could ride on horseback for hours without crossing paths with another soul.
Yeah.
And if by chance they did pass a man while riding unveiled, it's the man who would simply raise the hood of his jalaba, the jalaba, the traditional Moroccan robe.
Yeah.
So the man would raise the hood of his jalaba as a gesture of respect, showing the woman that he wasn't looking and he wanted her to know it. But here is the parts I find really striking. She also explained that in the harem, the confinement wasn't just physical. Mernissi said everything happens in the head. The harem is in this sense, it becomes a mental space, a space of control, of boundaries that has been internalized.
Yeah, indeed.
Yeah.
And I think probably that what makes it more powerful. It's not the space. It's not the physical limitation, but the mental one.
Yeah, exactly. And here is where language matters. Mernissi reminds us that the word harem comes from haram, which in Arabic means forbidden or prescribed.
Yep.
As opposed to halal, which means permitted.
Yep.
So the harem, as she explains it, is simply a protected space or a space where a man places his wife's kids or family. It could be a house, a courtyard, or even a tent.
Yeah.
And she gave the example of Mecca, the city in Saudi Arabia. Mecca is also called Al Haram because it's considered as God's sacred space, which is governed by God's rules, which every outsider must respect.
Yeah. And by the way, since we're talking about language, even in modern Arabic dialects, especially in the Middle East, the word harim means women.
Okay.
And I believe it's also linked to the whole inheritance, if you want, of the concept of harem.
Probably. Yeah. So the same logic, according to Mernissi, applies to the family harem. Because it's not just about the architecture or veils, it's also about who makes the rules in the harem, who is expected to obey them. Yeah.
Yeah. Actually, what I find interesting in your recollection of the book is that it seems that Mernissi is not writing about the harem to criticize it, but it sounds more like a recollection of how she experienced it in different situations throughout her early years and childhood. So she talks about the open and closed harem. And I feel it also provides historical and cultural context about it. I mean, I don't know if you see it that way as well.
It's hard to say. She published other books where she clearly kind of took position, I would say. But yeah, I guess I lean more towards your argument here that she kind of made a recollection of the differences between the closed harem and the open harem,
and maybe she keeps it for the reader to make a conclusion, to judge, so to say.
Yeah, why not? Why not? Yeah. And yeah, that's a very good transition to our next theme, which is about feminism momentum through the prism of Arab women. So as early as the second chapter, Mernissi dives into a rich and evocative narrative that pushes the reader to reflect on the condition of women. She brings up among other things, the story of Scheherazade from 1001 Nights. And yeah, we have been referring to the 1001 Night tales. So for those of you who may not be familiar with the tales, they revolve around a young bride who uses the power of storytelling to avoid being killed by her new husband, who is the king. And despite her young age, Mernissi was clearly disturbed by Shehrazad's tragic fate, and she offered her mother alternative endings to the story. So even then, you could see that this is a little girl sensitive to injustice and already emerging as a defender of women's rights. And another element that reflects her approach to feminist issues is when she brings up the story of Princess Boudou.
Which is also a 1001 Night story,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, exactly. So it was also drawn from the 1001 Night. And she begins by pointing out that if one looks for this story in the collection, they might struggle to find it. And for a good reason. Because not only does it appear quite late, I think on the 962nd night, so almost at the end of the book.
Yeah. And by the way, every night I think there is this story, or the Princess Sherazade tells her husband was gonna tell her a story.
Yeah.
Okay.
So the book is massive, as
yeah,
it's a massive work, and yeah, I own all the volume. By the way.
Have you read all of them?
Well,
I tried when I was a teenager. I tried to read it in Arabic. I think I managed to read half of it, but yeah, it's just too long.
Anyway, so the story of Princess Boudou, we lost track, right?
Yeah, it's you were saying she's in the one of the last latest nights,
so
962.
one of the reasons why you might not find it is because it appeared quite late on the 962nd night.
Yeah.
So almost at the end of the book. And the second reason is that the story is titled after Princess Boudou's husband. So the title of the story is the story of Kama al-Zaman.
Yeah. Talking about feminism and hidden women.
Yeah, so this to me is a very subtle yet powerful way of passively protesting the positioning of women in the storytelling.
Yeah.
It's a quiet critique, almost whispered, but no less impactful for its restraint. And Mernissi doesn't stop there. She goes on to suggest that perhaps this story came so late in the sequence because it was risky or even dangerous for Shahrazad to tell. Because remember, after all, her survival depended on keeping the king entertained each night without provoking him. So, you see,
I mean, what is special about the story? Why would it have provoked him?
Well, because Princess Boudou is no ordinary character, you know. She is a woman who disguises herself as a man.
Okay.
Assumes her husband's identity, convinces the entire caravan that she's a man, and later rules over the kingdom without anyone realizing she's actually a woman.
Yeah.
To me, it's perhaps the most radically feminist chapter in the entire memoir. Although this story is fictional, I think that's where Mernissi analyzes and where she quietly postulates that female solidarity may be the most powerful path for women to break free from the destinies of domination and pursue happiness on their own terms.
Yeah.
So, of course, I will not go into all the details of this story of Princess Boudou, but I encourage all of our listeners to discover the tale for yourselves. So you see, Mernissi doesn't shouts, she whispers, and even whispered her protest against how women are positioned in stories, or if you want, in society, is deeply moving. It invites the reader to look more closely, to question what's visible and what's hidden, what's said and what's left unsaid.
Yeah, that's very interesting. As you said, she whispers. It's very subtle, and I think that's a great point. Actually, the fact that she's not very frontal, if you want, she does not shout, and maybe like we need to look at this in context. So it's important to underline how delicate and artistically intriguing this subtlety is. In the same time, it doesn't take away, I feel, from the strength of the feminist message, especially looking from a contemporary lens. One could say, um, why didn't she protest the harem rules more explicitly? Okay, you said she did it in other books, but not in this one specifically. After all, kind of the violence of the confinement, especially of the closed harem, in theory, or when you think about it from our lens, should or can only fought through violence. However, on the other hand, also we should keep in mind that the society and the time Mernissi grew up in required navigating the lines of acceptance very carefully, I would expect, and especially also this is kind of a Moroccan culture, right? So it's a
Yeah.
North African culture, which
Yeah.
and the communication is what is known as high context. So, in general, people do not really. There is a lot of unsaid left. People don't really say what they think
Wait,
directly.
isn't that a high context thing from another book you read?
No, I don't think so. I did
High
this in.
and low context?
I did. Oh yeah, it's about cultures. Yeah. But
Culture
like it's
map?
yeah. The culture map. Yeah, but that's a business book though. Yeah, it's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead. Sorry, I cut you.
Yeah, no worries. But I mean, like in these type of societies, people don't really say things as they are. They're not down to earth in their communication. They leave a lot unsaid, and you're supposed to kind of understand it between the lines. And so I think there is an influence from that, and it also kind of this between the lines thing. I think protects the author and ensures a better reception of the message on the other side, because still, I mean, she lived between or in the latest century. Basically, the society is still conservative, and she needs to make sure that the reception is good of her book, to ensure that the message goes through.
Yeah. No, I agree. And there is another story. Another incredible story that Mernissi recounts, the story of a fearless woman named Tamu. Um, so, as fantastical as it may sound, this story is entirely true, according to Mernissi.
Yeah.
Because let us not forget that we are reading an autobiography. So, Boudou, 1001 Nights, those are tales, fiction. But the story about the fearless woman named Tamu is entirely true. And Tamu was a refugee. She had fled the Rif War, which was a brutal conflict between 1921 and 1926, where the Berber tribes from northern Morocco, led by some guy called Muhammad bin Abdul Karim al Hattabi, fought against French and Spanish colonial armies. So Tamu sought refuge in the farmhouse of Mernissi's maternal grandmother Yasmina. Um, so in what I referred to earlier as the open harem. And Tamu's arrival at the open harem is described as a scene straight out of a film. Mernissi writes that she appeared at dawn on the horizon of a fast plane. She was on a horseback, wearing a bright white man's cloak, and she let her hair show deliberately so that soldiers wouldn't shoot her. And she wore Berber bracelets, a dagger at her hip. Her body was tattooed.
Wow.
You know, a striking image that became something of a legend in the household.
Yeah, I'm definitely imagining like a cinematic scene
Yeah.
right now.
Now, why am I bringing up Tamu in the context of feminism? Because to me, she represents a powerful female figure in the memoir. Through Tamu, Mernissi offers us a different kind of Moroccan woman, courageous, free, rooted in her culture, but also bold and fully active in a male dominated world. Tamu had not, in reality, Tamu had not come to the farm to protect herself or simply flee the war. She had come to seek help for her people, for her community. So she could ride a horse, handle a rifle, speak Spanish, perform acrobatics. She was, a full fledged woman, strong, independent, and complete.
Amazing.
And yeah, and there is also a particularly revealing scene that Mernissi shares. At one point, her grandfather, um, from the maternal side, had to explicitly ask Tamu for her consent to confirm or rather consummate their marriage. And I say confirm here because, in fact, a marriage certificate had already been issued to Tamu when she first arrived. It was mostly symbolic or, let's say, bureaucratic, and it was meant to justify Tamu's presence at the farm. Because let's not forget, she was officially a refugee and had originally come only to seek aid for her family. So her presence needed to be legitimized in the eyes of both the authorities and the neighbors. And yeah, without diving too deep into the details, Tamu eventually settled at the farm and she ended up marrying Mernissi's grandfather. Yeah, and for those of you who may be wondering, yeah, Mernissi's grandfather was polygamous. He had multiple wives, and one of them was a black woman, which is an important detail that Mernissi does not shy away from. She also describes how this woman was integrated into the household. Yeah, but I won't go into the full story here. Uh, what I can say to the listeners is that this passage speaks volume about the remarkable social and familial diversity of that time.
Yeah.
I could easily spend more time exploring the feminist dimensions of this book, but I would like to move on to some other themes that I mentioned earlier. That said, what I find particularly striking in Mernissi's approach is the subtle way she compares the two harems, as we discussed earlier.
Yeah.
The one in her parents' home in Fez, the closed one, and the one in the rural farm, the open one. She uses them as a lens through which she questions the role of women in 1940s Moroccan society.
Yeah.
At first glance, one might expect a uniformly patriarchal society where women everywhere are subjected to the same rules and restrictions. But I think that's not what Mernissi shows us. She devoted many pages to the clashes between her mother, who was clearly outspoken and unafraid to challenge social conventions, and her paternal grandmother, who represents another era of society. And the paternal grandmother, clings tightly to traditions. And in one very striking passage, Mernissi writes, and I quote, "There were truly no limits to what women could do on the farm."
Hmm.
So the open harem here,
Yeah.
right? The women grew unusual plants, rode horses, moved about freely, at least on the surface. In contrast, she adds, our harem in Fez was a real prison. End of quote. So this duality is fascinating to me. It reveals that even in the 1940s, women's status was not uniform or fixed. There were unexpected pockets of freedom, spaces of quiet resistance, where women, especially outside the big cities, enjoyed a level of autonomy, which is far greater than we might assume. And Mernissi isn't just recounting her childhood through these memories, because from the very first page, she's asking deep questions about freedom, about social roles, and above all, about real possibilities that were or were not available to women in Morocco that was undergoing transformation.
Yeah. And I think the bottom line here is that the situation of women is not monolithic. I probably mispronounced that word, but as you said, it's not that all women are oppressed. It's true that the harem kind of brings that historical violence with it, and for example, the one in Fez, she says, it's a prison. But on the other hand, the one in the farm is a more open one, and there is also all of this change happening and the women asking for their rights and so on. So it's a dynamic and diverse situation that that she's recounting.
Yeah. Well, shall we move to the next theme?
Yep.
This one will be about education, and to begin this segment, I initially considered focusing on Mernissi's views on Islam, but then I realized there isn't actually much to say about her theology per se, at least not based on this book, because she doesn't dwell on religious doctrine, and her reflections on Islam in the memoir are more cultural than theological. I did come across the fact that one of her works, Le Harem Politique in French, the political harem in English. So this book was censored in some Muslim countries. But yeah, let's not get into that just yet. So what stands out more clearly in Dreams of Trespass are the parallels she draws between her early education at the Islamic madrasa and her later experience in the modern French-style school. That transition from one word of learning to another is far more revealing. But before diving into that, I feel like I can't talk about this book without mentioning her cousin Samir. I struggle to fully grasp the relationship, especially during the early years, because there is a kind of emotional undercurrent there that feels both intimate and distant. Sometimes it felt like a bond of complicity, other times like a quiet rivalry, or even a mirror reflecting the freedoms of boys that she did not
Have.
that she did not have. In any case, and no, I'm not reopening the feminism debate here.
Yeah.
But I bring Samir into the story here because Mernissi begins to frame her transition from Islamic madrasa to modern French style school as a somewhat gendered experience. For boys like Samir, going to school was, after the decision was made, it was simply expected. It wasn't something that required debate or justification. But for girls, it was a different story altogether. It required, for instance, she said, a direct advocacy of King Mohammed V himself, uh, who encouraged families across the country to send their daughters to school. And in Mernissi's own case, the decision to attend the modern school was seen as so significant that it had to be made during a special family council.
Wow. Sounds serious.
Yeah. And although it was her mom who pushed for this step, she herself, the mom, wasn't allowed to attend the meeting. Um, Although Mernissi doesn't explain why. At first, I assumed it was because women simply were not permitted to in those decision-making spaces. But then we learned later in the book that her paternal grandmother, the one that I previously portrayed as deeply traditional, was present at that meeting.
Maybe only women from a certain age are
Perhaps,
permitted
yeah.
to decision making.
Yeah. So instead of being there herself, Mernissi's mother asked her brother to represent her. And it was the brother who defended her position during the council and successfully argued that the young Fatima Mernissi should be allowed to attend the French style school. Mernissi would later describe this transition as life changing. She remembers the straight, almost austere environments of the Islamic madrasa, where every word mattered because they were studying the sacred text of the Quran, and mistakes were barely tolerated. And in contrast, the modern school felt remarkably easy to her. The pace, the tone, the roles, it felt like a space of possibility, one that shifted her sense of what she was allowed to imagine and who she was allowed to become. And to close this theme, I would like to offer a personal reflection here. To me, it feels like the fact that she experienced both education systems, traditional Islamic and modern secular school, is precisely what shaped the woman or the scholar and the writer she would later become.
Yeah.
She saw firsthand the gap between generations, between her own unfolding potential and the unrealized dreams of her mom. Her mom was a woman who deeply longed to be free, to escape the confines of the harem, but for whom it was already too late. And so, perhaps unconsciously, Fatima Mernissi seemed driven to do well in school, to reach and achieve what her mom had been denied. And by the way, I should also mention that Mernissi portrays her father with surprising warmth. She describes him as a loving and progressive man who was mostly, I would say, constrained by society. He was a monogamist, someone who did things that, frankly, many people today still wouldn't expect from a traditional Muslim husband in the 1940s.
Yeah. And here, since you talk about the dichotomy of both the traditional Quranic school and the modern French style school, I think it's the right time to come back to that concept or school of Islamic feminism that Mernissi is one of the founders of, as we mentioned earlier. And I think maybe this duality of both schools is what potentially drove her to become kind of one key figure of this current. So Islamic feminism is a feminist discourse and practice grounded in Islam. Basically, it aims to advance gender justice and equality by reinterpreting Islamic texts, also advocating for women's rights within an Islamic framework, and on the other hand, critiquing both patriarchal interpretations of Islam and also Western-centric feminist models. So I feel it's a rebellion, so to say, against patriarchy, but also against colonialism and the Western dominance of thought. For Mernissi, I believe it's both an affirmation of her identity and culture as a Moroccan woman, and also a claim of her freedom and self-determination as a feminist or as a woman.
Yeah, makes sense. So let's move on the last theme on identity and cultural blending in Morocco. But first, let's take a moment to look more closely at how this theme unfolds in the book. Not through grand declarations, but through the lives, memories, and everyday gestures of women around Mernissi. From the black wife of her grandfather to the way stories, trees, and even skin tones carried meaning. Identity to me in Dreams of Trespass isn't fixed or simplified. It's lived, felt, and constantly negotiated. Let me tell you one of those stories. Earlier I mentioned the black wife of Mernissi's grandfather, the paternal grandfather. Sorry, the maternal grandfather. um, her name was Yaya.
Mm-hmm.
And they briefly alluded to a story about how the other women in the harem had tried to integrate her into the household. And in the end, I'll just share this story with you. At first, Yaya, so the black wife, kept mostly to herself. But over time, she became the storyteller of the harem, captivating the women with tales from her village. And in return, the others began taking care of her chores, which to me was a genuine moment of mutual respect and shared humanity. And Mernissi writes that Yaya came from Sudan, though it's likely she was originally from what is now Mali or perhaps another country in West Africa, because she recalls that in Yaya's village there were banana trees and even coconut palms, but I'm not sure there are coconut palms in Mali.
Okay.
So it's quite possible that Yaya has seen banana trees, especially in the humid southern regions of Mali, in places like Sikasso or Buguni. As for coconut palms, which require very humid tropical coastal climates, they are far more common in places like Ivory Coast or Ghana. So maybe Yaya came from a more tropical area.
Yeah. But anyway, I mean, the modern day boundaries did not exist back then anyway, right? So she could be from anywhere.
The French Sudan is the region of what we now know as Mali.
Okay.
Yeah. So maybe she came from a more tropical area.
Yeah.
Either way, her stories profoundly touch the women of the harem, especially Mernissi's grandmother, Yasmina, and Tamu, the fearless woman, whom I mentioned earlier. So they set out to find those trees, and they actually managed to plant one in the farm. And for it was their way of helping Yaya feel a little more at home.
Yeah. And here also again at the risk of going back to the feminist theme, which I feel it's recurring even in the other themes that we're trying to cover. Um, I think it's important to highlight the value of feminine solidarity that the author is bringing to light. So the feminine solidarity in the harem, and then you talked about it earlier as well. Um, so basically, again, going back to the very early comment about this romanticized harem that we usually see in Western influenced cinema and television is usually one of women plotting and competing against each other. Um, I don't know, to get the closer to the sultan or whatever. But here I think it's refreshing to reflect on this experience where the women in the farm help plant these exotic trees to make Yaya feel less homesick. And feminine solidarity is indeed a topic that does not pour a lot of ink in literature and in cultural context in general. So, and by the way, that is a hint to the next book that we will talk about in the next podcast. Yeah, more African feminist literature on the way.
Cool. Okay, let's move on this last theme about identity blending. Mernissi also talks about musicians from Ghana who would come perform in Marrakesh, a city she describes as a true crossroads of cultures, where people of different skin tones, languages, and religions lived side by side. And she writes a line that I find absolutely beautiful. And she said, and I quote, "In Marrakesh, people would start dancing when their different languages no longer allowed them to communicate."
I like that.
End of quote. So she also notes the charm of being a foreigner, especially for Black visitors who came to Morocco back then. And having visited the country myself, I can say that that what she describes is still very much perceptible today. Morocco is indeed a land of hospitality. But let's be clear, Mernissi doesn't romanticize it. Alongside this celebration of cultural mixing, she also addresses its wounds. Displacements also was addressed, loss, and the legacy of slavery. One of the most poignant stories in the book is that of Mina, a black woman who lived in the harem in Fez. Perhaps more accurately, I would say she was part of the family, right? And Mina had been kidnapped as a child, along with other black children, and sold into slavery. Her story in the book is deeply heartbreaking because Mernissi writes, for example, that her captors would force her to climb down into a well as a punishment, which was a haunting image. It was quietly brutal. But I won't dwell on the darkest details here. But what stays with me is that Mina embodies a painful memory, that of slavery or uprooting, and of the complex dynamics of race and belonging in Moroccan society.
Hmm.
Yeah. And to end this reflection on a more hopeful note, there is a passage I find both moving and deeply insightful. Mernissi recounts a moment in her family when they learned that in the United States, white and black people were separated. And I believe she is referring to racial segregation.
Yeah.
So it came as a real shock, not just to her, but to everyone in the household. And what's truly fascinating is how she draws a comparison to something more familiar, which was the separation between Muslim and Jews in the city of Fez. Now, I'm not sure how much of that remains true today, but it speaks volumes about how Mernissi thinks through social boundaries.
Yeah. Some historians say that the concept of race based on skin color is a very recent concept. So ancient societies didn't see color, basically.
Hmm.
And I think based on these recounts, it seemed that the Moroccan society at that time didn't see the skin color as an aspect of differentiating people, but apparently, as you said, it wasn't the case for religion.
Yeah, that
Yeah.
makes sense. And what makes this passage especially powerful is what she writes next. And I quote, she wrote, someone who wanted to separate people in Morocco based on the color of their skin would have had a very hard time. And she explains why. She said, because people were so mixed that every shade existed.
Yeah.
Honey, almond, cafe au lait, and every shade of chocolate. Isn't that beautiful?
Indeed. Yeah.
So it's poetic and at the same time political.
Yeah.
It's a political way of saying that in this vibrant mixed Morocco, skin color wasn't a fixed category, but rather a living palette, a shared story, a collective richness.
I like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's her way of telling us gently but clearly that identity does not stand in opposition to diversity. It's nourished by it. Yeah. So, shall I continue? I could, but there's so much to say about this book. But really, it's hard to do justice to this book in just one episode. So I'll stop here and simply invite you all to read this book.
And so we close our journey through Dreams of Trespass, a memoir that whispers, questions, and gently dismantles the walls, both visible and invisible, that shape identity, womanhood, and belonging. If this story sparked something in you, pass it on, just like oral tradition. You've been listening to Threads of Africa with Ramdan and Hajar. A bientôt and stay curious.